The history of the Stanley Cup in the modern era is pretty well known. Fans of the game know how the Stanley Cup is earned, what teams have to do to get it, and how the mechanics of the whole playoffs work. And that remains true the further back in time you go. If you were to look at the 1980s, the 1970s, the 1960s, the 1950s, older people have either lived through these, or most fans know some knowledge of it, and it's not a big deal. Once you start getting to the 1930s and the 1920s, the whole system of hockey, the mechanics of the Stanley Cup, become a bit more obtuse. And as you go further back in time, you go further down the iceberg. And so prior to 1927, and then especially prior to 1918 with the formation of the NHL, the concept of the Stanley Cup becomes lost in this mystical soup of obtuse mechanics. And the part of hockey history that I want to cover today creates the bulk of that kind of soup. And that's the Challenge Cup. The Challenge Cup is really an era that people don't know much about. And whenever people talk about it, they talk about it as some sort of alien and distinct entity, which makes understanding it just a kind of dubious task. Or rather, they treat it in this way so that they can dismiss any kind of hockey from that era and just say, well, that's a Challenge Cup era, it's totally different, it's not the same. And while, yeah, there's truth to that, it's used to dismiss the era because no one really knows anything about it or wants to know anything about it. It's this very niche topic in the history of hockey. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the Challenge Cup. And I'm going to present to you the 3 problems I think there are surrounding this era of hockey. And then I'm going to go through and explain each of those problems with some detail, more of like an introductory, lightly covering it. I'll give some examples of the Challenge Cup, and I will give a summary of the successful challenges. So let's begin with the 3 problems. I think the first problem is understanding the lineage of leagues, which is my own coinage that I've used, and the associations that lead up to the NHL, along with the teams that played in them. The second problem is the mechanics of this Challenge Cup itself. It doesn't work like a modern Stanley Cup playoffs, so how do we make sense of it? And then the third one is, why is it so hard to get information on this topic? And I want to cover this one first. The problem of this third issue can be condensed to a single observation. There is no easily accessible, comprehensive online database for leagues, associations, players, and seasons covered during this era. There are sites like StatsCrew or Elite Prospects which do have some information, but it's hard to access those seasons from the website itself. You usually have to use a search engine to even arrive at that information. Other sites like HockeyDB are far more difficult to navigate, and it's not really clear if they have a lot of useful information on this time period. It's this really interesting twist that Wikipedia, of all places, seems to have the best organization of information for this era of hockey. And so on this slide that I'm including all the Wikipedia links that are necessary, along with some other links for StatsCrew and Elite Prospects. Along with it, I need to just say up front, I started this project as a casual learner. I am not an expert, and so I really just scalped Wikipedia for the sources they used. And I'm going to present basically all those sources here in a simple format. I haven't read any of them, but there are a few that have been used consistently, so I'll point those out. So in this further readings list, there are 2 pages of bibliography for books, and then a bibliography for newspapers, if you want to do primary research on this era yourself. The one that really stands out is Charles Coleman's The Trail of the Stanley Cup in 3 volumes. This is the central book, it seems, for knowledge of hockey in this era. I'm including all these sources because if you would want to create a database, you would probably have to do a lot of primary research and not just take stats from other sites. I've noticed that with StatsCrew, for example, there are some discrepancies between it and NHL.com or it and other stats sites, and I don't know which one is correct. And that's a kind of a problem that, a minor problem that tends to extend throughout many of the NHL stats sites online. And it would be really nice if we could have someone come along and create this comprehensive database so that this information is easily accessible and not lost to time in the obscure newspaper archives and books. The second problem, which we will get to right now, is what I have been calling the lineage of the NHL. Obviously, the NHL starts in the fall of 1917, but hockey goes way back in time. It goes back to the Victorian period in the late 19th century. Well, organized hockey. And the first Stanley Cup was awarded in 1893, which gives it, 14, 15 years prior to the beginning of the NHL. No, it's like 20 years. Yeah, like 25 years prior to the beginning of the NHL. So, what do we do? How do we make sense of this period? And so, at a glance, I've compiled the major leagues that matter for the formation of the NHL. And it begins with this hockey tournament in Montreal called the Winter Carnival Tournament, which lasts throughout the 1880s. It's not a league, but it is really the nursery of organized competitive hockey in North America. During the latter stages of the Montreal Winter Carnival, you have the Amateur Hockey Association of Canada, which is called AHAC. The teams of AHAC participate in the Winter Carnival, but it's also the very first, it's an amateur hockey league, but a competitive hockey association, at least in Canada. In 1899, there would be a controversy. I think it's actually in December of 1899, just before the start of the regular season, there was a controversy between the teams of AHAC and the bureaucracy of it. And so the teams revolted and quit the league and created a new one called the CAHL, the Canadian Amateur Hockey League. This lasted for 7 years, and it's just a continuation of AHAC in the same way that the NHL is a continuation of the NHA. It's not the same organization, but it's the same teams, revolted, created a new league, and continued on. The FAHL, the Federal Amateur Hockey League, which only ran for, it's 7 years or something, but 2 of the years matter for this lineage. They were made up of teams that failed to make the CAHL. So they applied to make the CAHL, but they were rejected for one reason or another, and so they just banded together and formed their own league. And it operated for 2 years before there was a merger. Some of the top teams of the FAHL and the teams of the CAHL came together to form the ECAHA, the Eastern Canadian Amateur Hockey Association. During the time of the ECAHA, there was a split decision between teams who wanted to remain as amateur hockey clubs and teams who wanted to go pro. The teams that went pro formed a new association called the National Hockey Association, while the amateur teams just kind of dropped off at that point. And so the ECAHA becomes the predecessor of the NHA, which is pretty well known for being the forerunner to the NHL. And then after 8 years, the NHA becomes the NHL. And so that's kind of the lineage of important leagues that will end up giving birth to the NHL. It's kind of like the family tree of the NHL. There are other important leagues like the Manitoba Professional Hockey League, but that doesn't create the NHL. It's part of this era, but not part of the family tree. Along with the leagues, let's talk about some of the important teams. On this first slide, you have all of the core teams that really start in the Amateur Hockey Association of Canada, AHAC. And the teams go as follows. You have the team on the left, and you have all the leagues that they've played in following it. So you have the Montreal Hockey Club, who played for AHAC. They played in the Carnival Tournament. They played in the CHL and the ECAHA. You have the Ottawa Hockey Club, who later become the Ottawa Senators, who later become the St. Louis Eagles. They played in all those same leagues, AHAC, the Carnival Tournament, CHL, and then they played a season unaffiliated with the league. Well, they ended a season unaffiliated with the league. They played in the FAHL, the ECAHA, the NHA, and the NHL, which is a record for the most associations that any team has played for. And they're kind of like one of the main characters of this era. Another important team is the Montreal Victorias. They're kind of equal of importance to the Montreal Hockey Club, and they played in the same leagues. As well as the Montreal Crystals and the Montreal Shamrocks. They were known as the Crystals during the 1880s, and I think they rebranded in the late 80s or early 1890s. But as you can see, those three Montreal teams stopped at the ECAHA, so they were teams that wanted to remain as amateur hockey clubs and not go pro. You also have the Quebec Hockey Club, and from the research that I've done, I think it is the same team that plays in the NHA, the Quebec Bulldogs, and it is the same Quebec team that plays one season in the NHL. I think they were called the Athletics, and then they relocated to Hamilton to become the Hamilton Tigers for a few seasons. So I've gone with that bit of evidence, and I've included all the leagues that they've, I think, played for. Teams who never played in the AHAC or CAHL are following, and they're important teams. We won't cover all of them in this video. The Winnipeg Victorias and the Kenora Thistles from the Manitoba Hockey Association. Their inclusion will become clear later on in the video. You have the Montreal Wanderers, who are also a very important team starting in the 20th century, who played in the FAHL, the ECHA, the NHA, and the NHL, famous for playing like 6 games, and then their arena burnt down. They refused to elaborate further, and then they just never appeared again. You have the Renfrew Creamery Kings, which are kind of irrelevant. Same with the Cobalt Silver. I think it's Cobalt Silver Kings. They're there. They're not really going to be covered in the video. For posterity's sake, the Les Canadiens and the Montreal Canadiens formed during this period, but they don't win anything in this period. And the Toronto Blue Shirts are the last team to win the Challenge Cup. So we aren't talking a lot about the NHA during this time period. So I'm including it, but they're not. They're like latecomers. And then the Victoria Aristocrat and Cougars, who played in the PCHA and WCHL, which is post-Challenge era. They're one of the last Challenge teams, and that's kind of a foreshadowing for the next era of hockey that comes after the Challenge Cup. So let's get to the Challenge Cup mechanics proper. The first Stanley Cup was given to the champion of the AHAC season in 1893. There was no conception of playoffs as a regular part of the regular season, so the team with the best record would win the season. So the Stanley Cup was kind of like a President's Trophy award in that sense. It was awarded to the Montreal Hockey Club, first winner of the Stanley Cup, and the Montreal Hockey Club had won the previous 5 championships. So this is like their 6th straight championship season. Because the Montreal Hockey Club is part of AHAC, the Stanley Cup is also appropriated by that association. So as long as that association has a winner, its next season's champion will also win the cup. So Montreal wins it in 1893, AHAC has the cup. In 1894, as long as AHAC still has the cup, the team to win the season would also win the Stanley Cup. But that can change. From the moment you win the Stanley Cup until the end of the next season, the challenge period begins. And if the champion is challenged by another team from another association, the Stanley Cup could change holders. So, if Montreal was challenged and they lost, the cup would leave Montreal and go to the team that beat them in the challenge. But it would also leave the association and go to the new association of whatever team successfully challenged and beat the hockey club. And to clarify, hockey seasons at this time started in January and they ended in March. While the challenge period began at the end of March with the end of the season, and it ran through to the end of March of next season, which means a challenge can be given at any time from March of one season, say 1895, all the way to the midway point or further through the next season in 1896, which makes dating Challenge Cups a bit more confusing. And we'll see examples of this shortly. What this also means is that using the modern NHL season dating format is actually unhelpful, because we will say a season like the 28th season or the 2008 season, we will say a season like the following, the 2007-2008 season, or just the 2008 season. And what we mean by that is that it begins in the fall of 2007 and it ends in the spring of 2008. But if we were to use that for this period of hockey, it would give us a wrong understanding of the season, because the season starts in January of the first year. So an 1895-1896 season means that the season occurred in 1895, but the challenge period extends into 1896. So it's just like a you need a different season dating style to cover this area, and trying to relate it to the modern way of dating NHL seasons is just not helpful. So let's go through a Challenge Cup example. In 1895 and 1896, the reigning champion of the AHAC Association was the Montreal Hockey Club. But at the end of the 1895 season, a new champion was awarded, which was the Montreal Victorias, who in 8 games went 6-2 with 35 goals for and 20 goals against. During their reign as champions, the Montreal Victorias faced one challenger, which is the Winnipeg Victorias of the Manitoba Hockey Association. The date of this challenge was played on February 14th, 1896, which was midway through the 1896 season, but it was challenged for the 1895 champion. In this game, Winnipeg actually beats Montreal. It is the first successful challenge in the Challenge Cup era, and so the 1895 champions lose their challenge in 1896, and so the cup moves from AHAC to the Manitoba Hockey Association midway through the 1896 season, which is just crazy, because that means all of a sudden you're not playing for the Stanley Cup, you're playing for the right to challenge for the Stanley Cup, and now the Manitoba Hockey Association is now playing for the Stanley Cup midway through the season. And so we pick up with the following year. Because Winnipeg won on February 14th, at the end of their season, they would be crowned as the Stanley Cup champion for 1896 as well. Note, their league had 2 teams, so it's very unbalanced and unfair. Following the end of the regular season, Winnipeg Victorias would enter their challenge period and accept challenges from other teams. The Montreal Victorias, who won AHAC, would re-challenge the Winnipeg Victorias on December 30th, 1896. This time, Montreal beat Winnipeg 6-5 to win back the Stanley Cup. So within a span of less than a year, from February to December, you have the Stanley Cup changing hands, changing associations twice. But the first time, Winnipeg wins in 1896 for the 1895 champions, and within that same year, Montreal in 1896 beats the 1896 Winnipeg champions. So yeah, it's a bit of a mess, but it's also super interesting. So what we can say in a summary is this. A Stanley Cup can be awarded once or twice each season. Once if the team wins their league and association and also beats all the challengers or doesn't have any challenges. And twice if a challenger beats the Stanley Cup holder in a challenge game. Now, that's actually wrong because the Stanley Cup is awarded every time a challenge game is issued. So if you as a team win the Stanley Cup and have 3 challenges and you beat all of them, you get awarded the Stanley Cup for the league and every challenge game. But for simplicity's sake, we can just reduce that to just say they just won it once and they won all the challenge games. So in my example, I gave the 1895 and 1896, which I'm just summarizing here. Montreal wins their association, but Winnipeg wins the challenge. And in the following year, Winnipeg wins the association, but Montreal wins the challenge. And in an example from 1899, the Montreal Shamrocks win the first CAHL, and they beat 2 challengers to keep the cup. Now, with these challenge mechanics established, you may be asking how many challengers were successful. Well, there are 6. Only 6 in a 25-year period. And these seasons can be put into 3 pairs of 2 seasons, back to back. So the first one is one we covered with our example earlier, so I won't go over it there. It's just repeated information. The next time a successful challenge happened was in 1900. The Shamrocks, repeated champions of the CAHL, would face a challenge from the Winnipeg Victorias again. Winnipeg would win and get the cup. The following year, Winnipeg would win their association and be challenged by the Montreal Hockey Club, who would win the challenge and get the cup back. 5 years later, in 1906, now in the era of the ECAHA, the Montreal Wanderers would win their association, but the Kenora Thistles of the Manitoba Hockey Association would challenge and get the cup. The following year, the Kenora Thistles would win in their rebranded Manitoba Professional Hockey League, only to lose to the Wanderers, who challenged and got the cup back. But outside of these 6 seasons, no challenge was successful. And note that from 1907, there are still 7 or 8 years where the Challenge Cup occurred. So while on the surface this Challenge Cup might be, this wild west of hockey, it's really not. The Cup, for the most part, stays within that lineage of the NHL. And the only teams to really successfully challenge come from the Manitoba Hockey League. No talk of successful challenges, however, would be complete without the oddity that is the 1904 Ottawa Hockey Club. They had won the CHL in 1903, so they were reigning champions. And during their fourth game, they had a controversy, something, doesn't matter. But the game was suspended, and they were winning, and the league wanted them to replay the game from scratch. And Ottawa said, nope, we're not going to do that. And it kind of escalated from there, and they ended up leaving the CHL. The CHL thought that they had the Stanley Cup, and so they should retain it. But the teams of the CHL said, no, Ottawa has the cup because they are reigning champions, and so the cup left the CHL along with the Ottawa Hockey Club. After they left that association, they took on challenges. They faced off against the Montreal Wanderers of the FAHL, and they tied 5-5. And so there was going to be another game, but the Wanderers didn't want to do another game, so Ottawa kept the cup. Then in early March, they played a best-of-3 series against the Brandon Wheat City of the Manitoba Hockey Association, which they won 2-0. And then they played Dawson City from the Yukon in a best-of-3 series, where they also won 2-0. Ottawa would finish that season as the Stanley Cup champions, the only time that the Stanley Cup was awarded to a team who was not affiliated with any league or association. The next year they would join the FAHL and defend their Stanley Cup title, so they would three-peat, and then they joined the ECHA the year after. So let's go through a number of firsts before we get to the end. The first challenge game is a bit of a mess, you could say. The Montreal Victorias won AHAC in 1895 on March 8th. But a challenge game was previously scheduled between the Montreal Hockey Club and Queen's University for March 9th, the day after. The bad timing of this challenge meant that Queen's University challenged the wrong team, or, as of the day prior, no longer the right team. But instead of AHAC forcing a change in the challenge, where Queens would play the Montreal Victorias, they instead just went through with the game as it was already scheduled. The Montreal Hockey Club would play for the Stanley Cup against Queen's University. But Montreal Hockey Club would be playing on behalf of the Montreal Victorias. If they won, it would be the Victorias, not the Hockey Club, who would get the Stanley Cup, which they did. Montreal won 5-1. So this is the only time in NHL history where one team won the Stanley Cup on behalf of another team. Montreal Hockey Club won the game, but the Montreal Victorias won the Stanley Cup. If we look at some of the first playoffs, because playoffs are beloved by hockey fans, in 1888, there would be a playoff game between the Montreal Hockey Clubs and the Montreal Victorias, who, throughout this presentation, you can see are kind of rivals. The Montreal Hockey Club would win this game 2-1 to be champions of their season. Note, this is before the Stanley Cup. Technically, the first Stanley Cup playoff games happened in 1894, 6 years later. There was a 4-way tie between Montreal Hockey Club, Montreal Victorias, Ottawa Hockey Club, and the Quebec Hockey Club. Quebec opted not to challenge, so there were 3 teams, and they played 2 challenge games, single game elimination. So the first one, the Montreal Hockey Club faced the Montreal Victorias, and the Montreal Hockey Club won the game 3-2. In their second game, the Montreal Hockey Club faced the Ottawa Hockey Club, and Montreal won this game 3-1. The first CAHL playoff game happened in 1903. The Ottawa Hockey Club, who would leave the league the next year, played against the Montreal Victorias, and Ottawa won the game 9-1. 3 years later, you have the first ECAHA playoff game between the Montreal Wanderers and the Ottawa Senators, who at this point were like the main rivals of each other. The Wanderers would win the game 12-10. Note, from the research that I did, I didn't find any FAHL playoff games, and I'm unsure if any ever occurred. The first NHA playoff game happened in the last season of the Challenge Cup era. The Toronto Blue Shirts would play the Montreal Canadiens. The Blue Shirts would win a 2 games winner gets the most goals series, 6 goals to 2. So in a total goals series, it doesn't matter if you win, lose, or tie. It only matters how many goals you score. But that also means if you win both games, you're going to score more goals. So it's kind of overlapping in that sense. And so those are all the first playoff games, in case you're really curious. To bring this presentation to an end, let me just give a breakdown of every Stanley Cup winner from the first to the end of the challenge period. So the way it's presented is this. Left column first, right column second. That's indicated by the year. Next to the year is the team that won the association, with their association or league bracketed next to them. Underneath, if there is no successful challenge, there's just an M dash, which is just that long dash that you see. But if a team did successfully challenge and win the cup, their name is recorded underneath. This is not a record of every challenge game. It is just a very simple summary of the winners. So in 1893, you have the Montreal Hockey Club from AHAC. In 1894, you have the Montreal Hockey Club from AHAC. In 1895 and 1896, which we covered in the examples earlier, Montreal from AHAC, but they lose to Winnipeg of Manitoba. That is reversed the following year. In 1897, the Montreal Victorias win, and in 1898, the Victorias win again. In 1899, the Shamrocks win. This is the first season of the CAHL. The following season, the Shamrocks win their association, but lose to Winnipeg. In 1901, Winnipeg wins their association, but the Montreal Hockey Club from the CAHL win the challenge. And then in 1902, the Montreal Hockey Club wins the CHL. This is really the first half of the Challenge Cup era, and you can see a stark contrast between this slide and the next one, where most of these teams, the Montreal Hockey Club, the Victorias, the Shamrocks, don't really continue their dominance. Instead, they're replaced by new teams. This new dominance is established by the three-peat of the Ottawa Hockey Club. The CHL champions in 1903. Then in 1904, they started in the CHL, but they left, hence the NA. And then in 1905, they were the champions of the FAHL, the only time that association won the Stanley Cup. And then in 1906, you have the formation, the merger, of the Eastern Canadian Amateur Hockey Association. The Montreal Wanderers won the first Stanley Cup of that year, but they lost to Kenora. The following year, Kenora won in the Manitoba League, but the Wanderers won the Stanley Cup back. Then you have 4 years of alternating champions. The Wanderers win in 1908. Now the Ottawa Senators win in 1909. The Montreal Wanderers win again in 1910, which, note, is the first season of the NHA, followed by the Ottawa Senators again in 1911. The last 3 seasons of the Challenge Cup are won by the Quebec Bulldogs, who win in 1912 and 1913. They had been with us from the entire beginning and are now only winning their first championships and only championships. And the last Challenge Cup is won by the Toronto Blue Shirts of the NHA. So to bring this video and presentation to a close, I just want to offer some reflections. The first is that this era of hockey might be in danger of fading into obscurity forever. And I wonder if this early history of hockey will be lost, or what steps we could take to preserve it and clarify it and present it to people who are fans of the game and fans of hockey history. Along that same note, down at the bottom of the slide, there are other leagues that are really important, like the Pittsburgh Hockey League in Pennsylvania, that goes back into the 19th century. We don't usually hear about these other leagues. They never challenged for the Stanley Cup, for example. But that means that Pittsburgh has a history of hockey going back to the 19th century, which equals their hockey heritage with that of Montreal and Ottawa to some degree. But you don't think of Pittsburgh as like a deeply hockey tradition city in the same way you would think of Montreal. So there's a lot more history in this time period that I didn't cover in this video. And now I think the Challenge Cup is a very interesting format, but it requires a number of small local associations. The ones that we covered were largely Ottawa and Montreal based. But for the challenge to work, you need associations in other places. There were maritime associations, so New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. There were Ontario, Toronto-based associations, and we didn't really cover any of those here. But for the Challenge Cup to work, you needed You needed that diversity of leagues. So once associations started to consolidate, so you have the FAHL and the CAHL, which could have been rivals for a long time, because they merged together, that is likely the death knell of the Challenge Cup formula. Because once you start to consolidate the best teams and the best players together, you destroy that diversity of opposition that you need for the Challenge Cup to survive. So what this means is that by the time of the NHA, the Challenge Cup was already an outdated mechanic. It was dying. It was on its way out. And it needed to evolve to fit the new landscape of hockey. And this change can be seen from its origins as an amateur competitive hockey concept to its professionalization in the early 20th century. And it'd be really interesting to see how the professionalization of hockey compares with the professionalization of sports in a wider North American context. And then a final factor that helps indicate the changes that you may not think about is the changes in population and perhaps even the changes in technology. Well, from what I understand, the Trans-Canadian Railroad was already built by this time. Canada's population went through a bit of a boom, especially near the turn of the 20th century. So you have 4.5 million people around the time that AHAC starts, largely concentrated in Ontario and Quebec. And by the time the challenge period ends, you have almost 8 million people, which is not quite doubled, but it is marginally close to it. So you have an explosion of population. Okay, well, I shouldn't say explosion. It's like a mini explosion, because Canada is still very underpopulated compared to the United States at this period. But that change in population does dramatically change what are the major centers. So teams like the Renfrew Creamery Kings wouldn't survive because they were in a mining town, but Toronto starts to become a very dominant hockey center, partly due with, presumably, population increase during this time period. And I mentioned technology. Maybe it's not super relevant here, but as travel technology becomes better and more widespread, that changes how far out the association can expand. One of the reasons why I think it is limited to Montreal and Ottawa is because of the limited transport infrastructure. But by the time of the 1960s or 1970s, you have airplane travel, you have good roads, you have better trains, you have better access to travel between places like Los Angeles and Philadelphia that you just don't have in this time period that we've covered. So the size and expansion of an association is probably limited by technological infrastructure of the time. But all that is to say, I hope that this presentation really helped to introduce to you the Challenge Cup. I obviously didn't cover everything. There were a lot of challenge games I just ignored. The NHA I just kind of ignored. But I think this is all right because I don't want to explain everything to you in fine detail. I would rather leave a lot of that material up for you to discover on your own. So with that being said, we could say more, but we can never really say enough. And I will have to end it here for today. Thank you for watching.